So, Marco, you're an environmental journalist, and you used to feel that nuclear power was an energy source without a future, a technology without a future. But you have completely changed your mind about that. Do you want to talk me through the process, why you used to feel the way you did, and
Yeah, of
what
course.
has changed?
It's kind of funny because as I was researching this book, I stumbled upon an article I once wrote. This was published in the year 2000. And I was writing about a climate conference organized by the UN. And at that conference, there was the nuclear industry was present, and it promoted nuclear power as the answer to climate change. And when I read my article, I noticed I was completely baffled. I thought, what does this industry has to do at this conference where people are trying to save the planet? And I think the last sentence of my article was that now is the time to kill the nuclear industry before it could ruin the future or something like that. So that's where I came from. I guess I felt at that time very much part of the anti-globalization movement. Naomi Klein's book, No Logo, was just out. I was out on the street sometimes protesting. So nuclear power didn't fit my worldview, I guess. Um, then, as an environmental journalist, I wrote a lot about clean technology. Climate policy came up, and I wrote a lot about solar panels, wind turbines, the coming of a hydrogen economy. And nuclear didn't have much interest. I guess I felt that was an old technology, old and tired. So we didn't need it anymore. It was too dangerous. And, these big clunky reactors, we could do better. And then I guess around 2010 or so, Stuart Brand came out with a book called Whole Earth Manifesto. And Stuart Brand, who was one of the original environmentalists, if you will, leading the Back to the Land movement in the 1960s, he said he changed his mind on nuclear power. And he said it wasn't so bad at all. Um, Safety was not so much an issue as he previously thought. The waste was not so much of a problem. And we simply need zero carbon baseload. And that's something that nuclear plants can provide, right? Just round the clock, clean energy. So I noticed that, but I still wasn't. I wasn't looking into the details, so I still felt it's not on the political agenda. Everyone's focus is with solar and wind. That's the future. But I guess maybe it took another, was it 7 or 8 years or so before I realized, well, climate policy is going really slowly. Global carbon emissions keep rising and rising. We need to do something more. And when we use solar and wind, mostly the backup comes from natural gas plants. So we still keep this fossil fuel industry going on. Now that's an industry that can ruin the planet, really. Um, and I guess it was here in the Netherlands when in politics there was talk about building 1 or 2 nuclear power plants in the Netherlands. And I thought, okay, now is the time for me to really look into this. And it's not that difficult. I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be really, really difficult, right? You always have 2 sides of a story. Where do you begin? But really, if you just pull out the established institutions, like the IPCC on climate change, they say nuclear power is a climate solution. You look at the International Energy Agency; they urge um, governments to build nuclear power plants, basically. You look at safety. Well, it's so much easier now, I guess, partly thanks to Wikipedia and thanks to reports being up online, to see that many of the things we thought about nuclear power are just simply wrong.
Mm. So tell us some of the things that we thought that were wrong. Maybe we could begin with safety.
Yeah, well, I guess if you ask 100 people on the street, probably 90 or more will say that nuclear power is the most dangerous energy source we have, because we think of Chernobyl, we think of Fukushima. But if you take a step back and consider that when you produce energy, accidents happen, right? When you mine resources, when you transport materials, the waste management, of course, is a big one. And you tally up all the deaths that can occur from accidents, basically, and pollution. And you look at, you tally the deaths and you look at per kilowatt hour. You can see that fossil fuels, of course, rank highest due to the pollution mostly. But also, a gas pipe can leak or can explode. A coal mine can collapse, that kind of thing. With hydropower, not many accidents happen with hydropower, but sometimes a dam can just break and destroy complete villages. You look at wind and solar, there are very few accidents, very few deaths. And nuclear is at the same level as wind and solar. It's really down the bottom, all three of them. And this is just something, this is in all kinds of scientific reports. If you look at Our World in Data, I love that website. They make it very visual. But we still think of nuclear power as something that can, I don't know. I guess people think that a reactor can explode like a bomb, maybe. They think, and they think it will hurt generations to come. There will be deformities among babies. There will be widespread cancer. But really, this is not at all true. This was true in part when it came to the Chernobyl reactor, which was not a meltdown, but a blow up, right? I mean, the reactor exploded there, and people went to hospital because of radiation sickness. So a few dozen people died fairly instantly, very relatable to the accident. There are more cases of thyroid cancer that has not been detected. That's another, what is it, a dozen or so? These are all estimates, of course. And then over a lifetime, like 60 years ahead or so, you look at a couple of thousand of additional cancer deaths. Very unfortunate, of course, and should have been avoided, of course. But this is a disease that happens to many of us, and we never know the real reason that cancer occurs, because a cancer cell doesn't say where the cancer is coming from, right? Whether it's smoking or stress or alcohol or the Chernobyl accident. We do know there's a lot of stress involved whenever an accident happens, and we saw this in Fukushima. The biggest public health hazard in Fukushima is not so much diseases that are relatable to radiation, because that is not at all the case. If you look at reports published by the United Nations Scientific Committee on UNSCEAR. I always use the acronym. UNSCEAR has published reports showing that there are no discernible health effects from the radiation that was leaked from the Fukushima nuclear reactor. There are no additional cancers, no additional leukemia or thyroid cancer, no additional heart diseases, no birth defects, no deformities. And this will not happen because the radiation that came into the environment was low or very low. That's what UNSCEAR is saying. And they don't expect any of these health results coming from the radiation. But it is very clear that there is a spike in all kinds of mental illnesses. So there's much more depression, for instance, more anxiety, but also more obesity, for instance. It's just, there was so much panic. And the fact that so many people, like 160,000 people, were evacuated and relocated, they lost their homes. They lost, their sense of community. They had to build up a new life. They had lost their jobs. And So there was a social stigma, for instance. Some people even came up with a whole new family history with a new name, so as not to say to other people that they actually came from Fukushima. I can imagine if you live in a place where there's so much hype about the nuclear disaster that was happening, then you start getting these kind of diseases. And this is what has happened. But it's not due to radiation, it's due to our anxiety, our response to a nuclear accident.
Yeah, I was very surprised reading the book to hear how small the number of casualties was in disasters like the 3 Mile Island disaster and Fukushima. That the casualty numbers um, are really quite insignificant compared to the level of fear and alarm and the perception of how disastrous those events have been.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, you can even wonder if disaster is the right word. I mean, a 3 Mile
Mm.
Island accident, nobody died, nobody got sick. There was hardly any radiation released. Radioactivity is all around us. We're surrounded by radiation, right? It's coming from below, from the ground. It's coming from our walls, from the building materials. It's coming from above, from the cosmos. So if you're taking a flight, for instance, you're exposed to more radiation. Radiation is completely natural. If you go to a hospital for a CT scan or just a dentist, that's radiation. Sometimes you don't want to have a CT scan, of course, but the alternative is sometimes worse, of course. But the radiation at 3 Mile Island was so very low; it's probably compared to a CT scan of some really a minor thing. So can you really say it's a disaster? I guess it was disastrous for the nuclear industry. That's certainly true. That took a big dent, of course. Other than that,
Yeah, I'll just say UNSCEAR is the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic
that's
Radiation.
atomic
That's what it
radiation.
stands
Yes, yeah,
for.
yeah.
Um,
Thank you.
can you talk a little bit about the idea that there is no safe minimum dose of radiation? So I know there's an acronym that's used here. It's called the no
The LNT
minimum level
hypothesis.
LNT. Yes.
Yeah, linear no threshold. Yes, it's
Linear
the
no
idea.
threshold. Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
And
LNT. Go ahead.
you tell the astonishing story of Hermann Müller, who was a researcher who worked on Drosophila fruit flies, who irradiated fruit flies, and found that bombarding the fruit flies with massive doses of radiation caused genetic damage, which was inherited by the next generation, as we would imagine. And he pioneered the idea of, sorry, can you say that again? No limited threshold, no limit threshold.
Linear no threshold.
Linear no threshold. He is the one who pioneered the idea of linear no threshold, i.e., that there is no safe dosage of radiation. And he actually won a Nobel Prize for that work 20 years after he'd conducted the experiments. And in fact, in the meantime, the idea of LNT had already been debunked when he received the Nobel Prize. Do you want to retell that story for our listeners? Because I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Um, Herbert Miller is an interesting guy to begin with. Uh, Working frantically on the fruit flies for many, many years, looking for well, when he introduced the X-ray machine with the fruit flies, he noticed something dramatic happened, which hadn't happened in all the years prior because he couldn't find any genetic changes. So um, he wrote a study about this, but the study was never published. He wrote an opinion piece instead, and that was published in a scientific journal. There were no references there. There was still no study, no report available. But he suggested that perhaps it was the radiation that was changing the genetic makeup of the fruit flies and possibly also in humans. And this was written at a time when indeed in certain industries radiation was causing workers to become sick. First, most of all, with X-rays in hospitals. So the medical assistants or doctors themselves would test X-ray machines by holding their hand in front of the machine to make sure it was working. Well, their hand suffered quite a bit. A lot of medical workers developed forms of cancer that were very much related to the radiation that they were working with on a daily basis. There was also the story of the radium girls. So these were young women working at a factory where they were painting radium on watches so they would glow in the dark. And whenever they brushed these watches, they would lick the tip of their brush with the radium and then do their painting. But all this licking, all this radiation, it caused their jaws to fall out, basically. These were terrible diseases. So we knew by then, when Herman Muller was working with the X-rays machines and his fruit flies, that there was something going on with radiation, and cancer was back then a disease that was very much prevalent and nobody knew what to do about it. There was a stigma on it. So that was the background. He published his op-ed piece. There was a lot of discussion about it. Then there was an economic crisis. There was no funding anymore to publish a report. Herman Muller never published the report. It was only an opinion piece. He moved to the Soviet Union. He was very interested in eugenics by then, and he thought the world revolution could be beefed up if you had the right genetic makeup of the proletariat in Russia. Stalin didn't like his ideas at all, and he had to flee. He came back to the US and was looking for work, found work for the government, and later, after the World War ended, realized that his work was related to the development of the atomic bomb that was used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. I guess the Nobel Committee may have been interested in making a political statement or so, but in any case, they awarded Herman Muller for a study that was never published, that had no reference. It was simply an op-ed piece from years and years ago. And he was awarded a Nobel Prize in medicine or physiology. With that Nobel Prize to his name, he became a prominent figure. And he was invited to a committee in the 1950s to study the effects of atomic radiation for once and for all. And this had to do with the anxiety in the United States from the fallout from atomic testing. And also because there was talk of a nuclear power industry being built up pretty quickly in the 1950s. And there was a study involving geneticists and biologists and a lot of experts. Herman Muller was part of that commission. And in the end, the report they published got a lot of traction, got a lot of publicity in the New York Times, for instance, with numerous articles and verbatim text from the report. And the conclusion was that all radiation was bad. There is no safe amount of radiation to which you can be exposed without having any health damage. And it doesn't even matter if you're exposed to all this radiation at once, or if your body just builds it up over time, as we do with a lot of other substances, of course, and elements. And the advice in the Commission's report was to slow down the development of atomic power because of all the radiation that was going to be leaked in any nuclear power plant. The waste was going to be terribly dangerous. this report was, I have a lot of this knowledge coming from, what's his name? Rod Adams, I think, with his Atomic Insights blog. He showed that that this report was paid for and initiated by the Rockefeller Foundation, which of course has all its fortune in fossil fuels. And even the committee was chaired by not by a scientist of any standard, but by a Rockefeller employee. And this all makes sense, I guess, with having two stories here now, of course, one about radiation and one about the involvement of the fossil fuel industry. But at that time, coal was big, of course, oil was coming up as a way to produce electricity, and atomic energy was coming up. And we're talking about the 1950s when a lot of progress was made and we needed more energy, and coal reserves were going down. So I guess for the fossil fuel industry to maintain their position, it made a lot of sense to, well, to make the competitor look bad, right? That's just common business sense, I guess. And it looks like this is what happened in the 1950s, trying to slow down nuclear power and keep fossil fuels going on. The thing about what you were saying, that there was already the study by Herman Miller was already debunked. That's actually a more interesting story here. So in 1946, there was a young scientist, I think his name was Kaspari, and he did the same study as Herman Miller did, and he came up with a completely different result. He showed that there was not at all, that there was not something like a threshold, that there was actually a threshold doses, because low amounts of radiation don't do that much damage. Just to summarize his story, the study was reviewed by Herman Miller just before he received his Nobel Peace Prize. He had seen it, he had responded to it, but still in Stockholm receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, the Nobel Prize for Medicine or Physiology in 1946, he said that there was no escape from the conclusion that any level of radiation was harmful. Well, there you have the story of Herman Miller.
Yeah, incredible story. And he told his children not even to get dental x-rays.
Yeah, true. Yeah,
I
if
recall.
all radiation is bad. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
I'd like to. So here in Australia, we do not have nuclear power, apart from one research reactor, which is here in Sydney. And I'd like to talk about some of the arguments against nuclear power here, and see what you have to say to them. I think the main argument that's made is that nuclear is too expensive, and that it is cheaper to use a combination of fossil fuels and renewables. And in fact, our Prime Minister actually said that the sun was the cheapest source of energy because solar energy is free, which seemed to
Nice.
me to be a misunderstanding of what costs are actually involved. So I think that at some point in the book you say that nuclear is an expensive way of getting cheap energy, whereas renewables are a cheap way of getting expensive energy. Could you talk a little bit about the costing, and maybe in connection with that, EROI, the energy return on investment from nuclear, compared to the EROI of fossil fuels and renewables, and perhaps fossil fuels and renewables in combination?
Right.
So first of all, why is the sun not just free energy? Why do we have to pay
Well,
for energy here in Australia, given
it,
how sunny it is?
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it is sunny, of course, and it seems like a perfect spot to have lots and lots of solar panels indeed. Well, solar, I guess solar is free, but oil is free as well, or uranium or coal. But you have to take that energy and transform it into something useful, right? Whether it's
Well, talking of the
solar or
sun, I'm just going to switch the light on here since the sun is actually going down. But yeah, okay.
this is a perfect example of the limits of solar power, right? The light is going down in Australia and you have to turn on the lights now. Yeah. Now, so yes, of course, energy from the sun is free, but you have to translate it into something that is useful, that people can get from the electricity grid, and that costs money, right? And it's the same for any other resource. Um, nuclear Building a nuclear plant is incredibly expensive. Yes, very much so. And I guess nuclear power is expensive, but there is nothing inherent about nuclear power that should make it expensive because very little resources are used. You need little uranium that should be enriched, and you use it and you burn it up. Um, but the energy density of uranium is so immense that you need very little of it. So you have very little cost in resources, in materials. A power plant is mostly concrete, and a nuclear power plant can last 80 years, maybe 100, maybe more, because you can still update things inside the reactor. Um, so all this makes, if you look at a longer term and spread out costs over a long period, nuclear power shouldn't be that expensive at all. Also, the cost of building a nuclear reactor is high because mostly because governments are wary of giving, what's the word, guarantees, I guess. So investors have to go to the private market to borrow money, and more than half of the cost of a nuclear power plant is in paying back the interest from the loan they took. But the cost can be much lower, of course, if a government promises that it will keep the nuclear plant running for so and so long, or even become co-owner or something like that. This wasn't at all unusual back in the day before we had to privatize the energy market in the 1980s or something. So there are fairly simple ways of bringing down the costs for nuclear power. The thing is, solar power is cheap, wind power is cheap, but they're cheap when the sun shines or when the wind blows. If you want to look at the energy as a system, something that works whenever you want energy, then you'll have to add costs from, I don't know, maybe a battery or so that can store energy, right? Or you have to look at the cost of a natural gas plant, because usually if there is no sun, if there is no wind, it's the natural gas plant that is running to make sure that everybody has electricity, right? And can turn on the lights in Australia when the sun goes down. Is it now, in some way, I think it's fair for these costs to be part of the cost for wind and solar, right? Because they're just not compatible. You can't really compare the two. It's a different kind of thing. You can compare power coming from a nuclear power plant with power coming from a coal-fired plant or natural gas plant, for instance, because these are competitors. But solar and wind are simply not. They're not in the same. They're not in the same ballpark, right? So it would be comparing apples and oranges, I guess.
So the full cost
Um,
comparison would be between renewables plus the fossil fuels that are supplementing them to make it possible to have a continual
yes,
supply.
yes. Or hydro. Sometimes hydropower is used to store energy, but you need something. If you use solar and wind, you need something that can be turned off and on, and that can be regulated, basically. And the sun doesn't You can't regulate the sun, right? It's there when
Mm,
it's there, and
yeah,
it's wonderful. And I think Australia is in a perfect spot to have lots and lots of solar panels. Yeah, yeah. It should still be distributed, of course, to the cities where most electricity is used, and you'll lose some of the power when transporting all that energy. But still, it makes sense. But also, I think Australia has quite some uranium mines, right?
yeah, yeah. I think
I
it's a
think
third of
actually
the world's
Australia is,
uranium is here.
yes, yeah, yeah, yeah.
And
So it's kind of
Australia is
funny
a
that
massive exporter of uranium, is particularly to China, where the Chinese are
right,
have said that they're building. How many nuclear power plants are they planning to be building
I think
over the next
150 or
15
so in
years?
just 15 years. Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah,
And so
my
there is a ban, you
concern.
say, on using nuclear power, right? I
Yes,
think it's one
that's
of the
right.
few countries, yeah, yeah, where this is. Do you know when came this ban through? Were the Greens ever part of the government in Australia?
I don't know that actually. I do know that Denmark is also just about to institute a ban. And my concern about renewables in Australia is that um, they're not cost effective, even in our very sunny country, and they're being used as an excuse to not have nuclear. So many people argue that nuclear will not be possible in Australia because nuclear power plants produce energy at a constant rate, and we need a source of energy that can be turned on and off very easily because it needs to coordinate with renewables. And that seems to me like a cart before the horse argument. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah. Well, if your concern is getting energy with a very low carbon footprint, low ecological footprint, um, then it's kind of weird to prioritize one over the other, right? You would need all of it, I suppose.
Mm.
We,
Mm.
we will need lots and lots of more clean energy, right? I think we all agree on that. And it can come from solar panels, it can come from wind turbines, it can come from a nuclear power plant, it can come from a hydropower plant. But those are basically the options we now have. Um, it feels kind of weird to prioritize solar power over nuclear power when using solar power involves so many things to regulate the grid, because you have, yeah, indeed, you have to have something. You have to have a natural gas plant, for instance, uh, stand by all the time and increase its power when the sun disappears. That's a lot of work, whereas a nuclear power plant just provides the same clean energy 24/7, right? So why is solar power then? Why should it be prioritized? I don't. I never get it. I do understand when people have solar power, solar panels on their roof. I have that too. It makes a lot of sense to do that, I guess. And I have to be thankful for the Dutch taxpayers for contributing to the solar panels that I have. Um, but it doesn't feel right to say that it's one or the other, given if it's true that that we need a lot of more carbon-free energy, and I do think that's what we need. Then why limit the toolbox, right? Why say, oh, we cannot use this, we'll focus everything on that? Why not use nuclear? Why use solar and wind? Or the other way around? Why only use nuclear and not use solar and wind? Because that's what some people say as well. I think we should do all we can. And but in comparing nuclear with renewables, I think we should always understand that it's only nuclear that is a real competitor to fossil fuels, whereas renewables are simply not.
Yeah. Um, could you talk a little bit about people's fears about nuclear waste and also about um, just run us through what happens with waste products from a nuclear power plant and um, And perhaps talk a little bit about breeder reactors and the reusing of waste.
Yeah, yeah. Aaron, could I just take a break? I
Yeah, of course.
need some water. My throat is still not. I'm still fighting off that cold. I'm sorry. Could I
Oh,
get some
sure.
water?
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm going to
Okay.
eat some yogurt at the same time.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm back again. I hope my cold is not it's distracting too much.
No, it's absolutely fine.
No? Can I just
No, I
quickly
think
look
it's
up
not noticeable.
something when it
Yeah,
comes
go
to
ahead.
the waste thing? Because I'm sometimes you've noticed I'm looking for the English words here, and doing a
Yeah,
podcast
no
for so
worries.
long is yeah. Let me just quickly see here. Yep. Where shall we pick it up after your question on what's
Yeah, I
happening with the
wanted
waste,
to
right?
you yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk a bit about nuclear waste and waste
So
storage and what the waste products are that are coming out of a nuclear reactor, how they're being stored at present, and what the future possibilities are, for example, with breeder reactors, which I know have been around for quite a long time already.
so the spent fuel from a nuclear reactor um, consists of many different kind of elements with different kind of how you say it longevity. Um, the the spent fuel needs to cool down, so it cools down in a pool, typically at the nuclear plant. Some countries leave it there for a very long time, like Finland, but basically it has to be cooled before it can be powered into concrete or glass, and then it's stored in a canister, I guess is the word. Um, Very thick layers, and it's stored either again at the nuclear power plant or at a facility. We have a special facility in the Netherlands, for instance, just across the street from the nuclear power plant, um, which is that's called a temporary storage, because eventually the nuclear waste should be stored underground, and underground meaning in a geological repository. Again, Finland is here the country um, that's leading the world in a way. They're about to open Onkalo, which is Finnish for cave, I think. This is 500-meter deep in granite. There's a very complex building um, that was built where all the nuclear waste from the nuclear power plants in Finland is supposed to go in the coming decades for eternity. Basically, that's the process of nuclear waste, and we should acknowledge that nuclear waste is sort of it's a container word. The Many of the elements making up nuclear waste, um, the radioactivity just is very brief, and is not very harmful at all. It's really the spent fuel that is what I think should be called nuclear waste, because that's the part that needs to be buried underground and for eternity, right? It's not in volume. Well, I said before here that uranium is so power dense that you need little uranium in a nuclear power plant, um, and this is also true for the waste, of course, because the waste is only the uranium coming out of the reactor again. If you look at the highly radioactive spent fuel that needs to be stored the way they do it in Finland, we look at all the nuclear power plants in the world, that's hundreds of them, um, producing electricity since the 1950s. If we add up all that nuclear waste, you could fill a football stadium, and that's it. And this is so little if you compare it to any other industry, if you compare it to any other energy. industry, if you will, where all the waste is just going up into the atmosphere, or other facilities leaking, stuff, chemicals in water or the soil. The nuclear waste is contained. It's not much in volume, and it's contained well. It's well separated from nature. And we know this because nuclear waste from a power plant has never sickened or killed anyone. We know how to deal with nuclear waste. Basically, like flying. Flying is dangerous, right? You're sitting in a chair in the sky, but somehow we've managed to make that safe, right? And I don't know, more than 1 billion people a year take flights. So we know perfectly well what to do with it, how to keep it out of the environment, and where to store it. In my chapter on nuclear waste, I'm somewhat skeptical about Onkalo. I know this repository is praised much by everyone in the pro-nuclear community, but I think Onkalo sends a worrying message. I think it sends the message that there is something fundamentally dangerous about nuclear waste, so dangerous that it has to be tucked away deep underground, and it has to be sealed so that nobody can ever enter it again. And I think if that's your story, burying your waste product deep down, I think you send a message that is terribly dangerous. And I think it makes a lot of sense for people to be anxious about nuclear waste, because if it's not so dangerous, why would they bury it? I know something that is much better, a much better way for nuclear waste, for the spent fuel, is to recycle it in what's called a breeder reactor. This would work in a way that we take the highly radioactive waste, which still has so much energy left still in that waste. We can use it at the front end of a nuclear reactor, of a breeder reactor, and use it again, and then use it again, and we can recycle it. This is standard environmentalism, basically, what I'm saying here. But this is not what is being done. It can be done, but it's not being done. We've had a couple breeder reactor programs in the past. Most of them have stopped for various reasons: economic, technological, probably political as well. But we know they work, and we know it's a good way to get rid of nuclear waste. So I think we would be doing everyone a favor if we start looking again at these breeder reactors and use those so we can get rid of the waste at the same time and have clean energy. What else do you want?
Thanks. Can you give me a kind of best case and worst case scenario for Australia without, let's say, without nuclear power?
I think coal is big in Australia, right?
Yep.
I simply think it will be very hard, or maybe impossible, to really replace coal with just solar and wind. And this has everything to do with the fact that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. It's just basic stuff, really, but it's true. So Australia will need to find something else. I don't know if there's much opportunity for hydropower in Australia.
No.
Whether there's more.
There's not.
No.
And it's also not very windy here either.
And not very windy either. Yeah. Well, good luck if you really don't want to use nuclear power. I mean, there are very few countries in the world that have booked any success to speak of in bringing down emissions. And those countries use a combination of hydropower and nuclear power. Now, hydropower is not a given in. I live in the Netherlands. We don't have any hydropower, of course, because it's a flat country here. And this is true for many places. There is some potential still for hydropower in some African countries. But we've basically depleted all the options for hydropower, uh, as far as I know. Um, and then there's nuclear power, which can be produced anywhere. Uranium, well, a lot of it is coming from Australia, of course, but we know uranium is everywhere, um, on all the continents. So that should not, and it's abundantly available, and you don't need much of it. And there's nuclear waste, so we don't have to mine for uranium if we build these breeder reactors. Um, well, maybe there will be a miracle and there will be a fantastic battery using very little resources, because of course we have batteries, but they don't store energy for that long, and it's really hard making a battery that can store energy very long. You need lots and lots of chemical compounds and everything to get to such a reactor, to such a battery. So that's going to be hard, I guess. There could be something called a smart grid. So there would be supply and demand being very intelligently, that they would, how do you say it? An intelligent grid that knows when when you should use your washing machine, for instance. Um, all this can work. The battery, um, the the grid, the intelligent grid, but it's not there yet. But what we do know works is nuclear power. This is a proven technology, and we know that it can replace fossil fuel, right? So I just don't understand why people keep dreaming of solutions that may come to fruition, but sort of reject the solutions that are already there, right? And I will say that it takes a long time before a nuclear power plant is finally built. It just the building takes, well, I think the average building time is somewhere around 7 or 8 years, really. But in Europe, with newer reactors, the building time was closer to 18 or so, right? Also in the US. So maybe, but in China, they do it faster. The South Koreans can do it faster. Maybe we know how to do it faster. Maybe regulations will ease a little bit, right? So we can build faster. But getting permits takes a long time. There's, of course, this fantastic thing called democracy. And I don't mean that cynically at all, but people have a say in this as well and what is happening in their environment, right, in their area. So people should have a say as well, and there should be public support, I think, whenever a nuclear power plant is built. So yeah, it takes a long time, and in the meantime, we're probably going to have to live with the fact that nuclear power has been postponed for so long, and people have been saying that, oh, nuclear power comes too late to solve climate change. I've heard that 20 years ago already.
Yeah, yeah.
And if we keep
The
saying it,
best
well,
time.
it's true, right?
Yeah,
Climate
yeah.
change is already upon us, and I guess we'll have to learn to live with climate change. And um, nuclear power is not going to stop it, but it will be very useful once the planet is getting hotter and hotter, right? We'll still need energy then.
I had one more question, which was about Africa and the developing world. So I believe that African contribution to climate change, African emissions from the entire continent made up only 4% of climate change. And yet the countries of the West have begun to uh, stymie and prevent projects for the building of fossil fuel industries in Africa because of concerns about climate change, have cut off money for loans for that. What kind of future can there be for a nuclear Africa, especially given how unstable many governments are in that region?
Yeah. Well, it's really going to be challenging. I know there are quite some countries in Africa interested in nuclear power. Um, I don't always know how far these plans are. Some countries have been talking with Russia about these nuclear power plants, and we don't know what the status is, of course, with these projects. Currently, there's only one nuclear power plant in South Africa since the 1980s or something. But that's it. There are some reactors, some research reactors, I think, just like Australia has. But that's about it. I will say that you can just, there are a lot of safeguards, not only when a nuclear plant is operating with, inspections and everything from independent organizations, but also before you actually start building. So there has to be some level of confidence and trust before any country, any company would start building a nuclear power plant. Having said that, it costs a lot of money. It's much cheaper to build another coal plant in Africa. It's much cheaper even to build a natural gas plant, even though that's a little bit more expensive and a little bit more difficult because of the pipelines and everything. Um, it's also cheaper to build wind farms and solar farms. There is, from the international community, quite some money available if countries in Africa want to use these renewable sources. But funding is not available if countries are interested in nuclear power and not even in hydropower, in big hydropower, or in coal and natural gas. Even though some of the countries that have pledged not to support Africa in these efforts, they still use coal-fired plants and gas plants,
Yeah.
of course, and even
Hello,
opening mines and
Germany.
everything. Hello,
Yeah.
Germany. You're being watched. Yeah. And that has to change. Maybe it has to change that the World Bank, the world's largest uh, uh, fighter of poverty officially, when they would open up to nuclear power, and I think even coal and natural gas, this would help African countries so much. African people are in desperate need of reliable energy, right? They should have access to an electricity grid that provides electricity when they need it. Africans have mobile phones and they have refrigerators, and if they don't have them, they want them. They want to have them, right? So I think we should do a lot more to alleviate poverty in Africa, and maybe put our climate targets even aside for a moment and help African countries develop. That would be best. It would be fantastic if African countries could develop nuclear power. I mean, there are universities. I was once in a debate with somebody who was just astonished at the idea of a nuclear power plant in Africa. And he basically was saying that these people were not educated and could never deal with safety instructions. I think, but don't you know there are universities in Africa? Don't you know these people are educated? They get the training and everything. There are safeguards, there are inspections. It's not some wild place where modern technology cannot survive.
Yeah,
So yeah, I think that
absolutely.
that would be a way forward, just helping countries to develop first, and ideally do it in a way that would not pollute the environment and heat up the planet.
So, what would be the number one first priority that you would like to see happening with regard to nuclear? I think this will be my last question, unless there's anything else
Mhm.
that we haven't covered that you think we should have covered, because I know you're fading a little bit. Your throat is
Yeah. My
sore.
fighting off a cold here. Let's see. I think what would be really helpful is if we loosen up regulation, if we really get our act together in a political way to start building nuclear plants in mass production, basically, do massive orders rather than just one or two. And in Europe, we could do this together. Well, hello, Germany. Hope you're listening. We should do this together to have more nuclear power here. Maybe even more importantly, is do it in places where there is so much growing demand for energy, places such as in Africa. Because replacing natural gas plant or a coal plant is one thing, but if you build something new, you want to add basically energy to the world, right? Because there is so much demand for more energy and more electricity in the world. Maybe you need to focus there. Maybe we should start building a nuclear fleet throughout Africa and use our development aid money partly to make sure that that will happen. I think these breeder reactors should be really cool, just so we can get rid of the nuclear waste and stop mining for uranium, even though uranium mining is not so much of a problem for the environment at all, but still it would be good to recycle, right? That would be good practice. So yeah, these are the things that I think should work. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Marco. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm going to switch off recording. Don't close the window just yet.